I'm Schizofenik, and for over 20 years I have been engrossed with Batman graphic novels, but never have I read stories as disturbing as the ones you're about to see. Through the duration of this video, I will explore stories that deal with the most disturbing themes. Some of these tales rival the most frightening of Hollywood movies. Join me as I try to decipher my top 5 most disturbing Batman graphic novels in rank order. Before we begin, however, I must explain that I have excluded any moments involving the Joker for good reason. Despite the fact that he has many disturbing moments capable of making this list, I have already made a whole top 5 video on his most disturbing moments, so if you wish to watch that, then please click the link. When constructing this list, I had to understand that fear is a highly personal feeling that is triggered when we perceive imminent danger or threats. It can cause a flight or fight response, and on occasion, paralysis. It is therefore fitting that I begin my list with a graphic novel that is obsessed with it. My journey begins at number 5 with David Finch and Paul Jenkins' Cycle of Violence. The story centers around Jonathan Crane's alter ego, the Scarecrow, who is kidnapping children and releasing them back, altered emotionally. One of the most visually grotesque moments involves the Scarecrow sewing his own mouth shut as part of an elaborate plan to induce fear in a kidnapped victim. This comic clearly begins as it means to go on, with extreme violence and constant horror. We later witness a flashback to Dr. Crane's early years as a psychologist for phobias within the university. After being dismissed for some rather extreme methods, Crane goes to work for himself, where things only get worse. It is during one of these therapy sessions where Crane brutally slashes the throat of one of his patients with an aptly named cutthroat razor. This moment suggests that we trust our psychologist with our most intimate secrets, and as a result, leave ourselves vulnerable to them, both emotionally and physically. Crane reminds us that it would not be too difficult for a psychologist to abuse that trust and power. It is not until we delve further into the psyche of Jonathan Crane when we realize why he has become the fear-obsessed monster that is the Scarecrow. When collecting the fearful tears and sweat of a girl he kidnapped, he is troubled by the compassion that she shows him. As she pleads to be released, the Scarecrow crumples to the floor as he is overcome by flashbacks of his own confinement at the hands of his father's sadistic experiments. As part of his research, a young Jonathan Crane was routinely locked in a basement and surrounded by instruments of fear. It was during one of these experiments when his father died of cardiac arrest, leaving his terrified son Jonathan trapped in the pitch-black test chamber for days. This comic certainly deserves its place on my list as it combines psychological horror with extreme gore, and it explores the highly dark subject matter of child abduction. It could be argued, however, that my next entry explores even darker subject matter. Some people become the victims of actions that are so horrific that they later manifest themselves in strange behavior, phobias, and nightmares that leave them crying in the middle of the night. At number 4, I have chosen Archie Goodwin's Night Cries, which deals with a highly disturbing subject of child abuse. There is, however, one particular moment from this graphic novel that shocked me to my core. In actual fact, I had to reread the pages to fully comprehend and digest what I had just witnessed. Whilst investigating some drug dealers, Batman and Commissioner Gordon notice a similar series of murders involving child abuse and the death of the abused children's parents. In an extremely macabre case of poetic justice, whatever abuse the parent carried out on their child is brought back upon them by this new criminal. For instance, a mother who failed to call child services is hung with the cord of a phone, and a father who watched twisted pornography has his head smashed through a TV. Batman and Gordon subsequently embark upon a quest to find the serial killer. However, in a strange twist, Batman finds himself at the heart of the accusations, identifying him as the vigilante who's killing the abusers. One child recounts the moment when Batman allegedly climbed through the window and murdered his father. However, we later discover that the reason for this may have been because his father used Batman as a scare tactic in order to prevent his son from revealing their quote-unquote secrets. As we wonder what these secrets could be, we see the bloody remains of his father, which begins to answer some of our questions. His blood-covered legs and groin area lie next to a glass bottle, implying a horrific rape. Ultimately, his own despicable acts upon his son are turned on him by the killer using a glass bottle as a phallic object. Moments later, the abused child reveals that after his mother had left them, his father forced him into a role-play game where he would play the girl and his dad the boy. These words are symbolically mirrored through the boy's positioning of his action figures. Ultimately, this boy's inability to understand what his father had been doing to him manifests itself as a phobia of Batman. Furthermore, the incredibly dark subject matter of this book is reinforced through Scott Hampton's impressionist style and dark, bleak tone. But for me, the most disturbing thing about this novel is that child abuse is not the creation of any writer, but a very real event. Unfortunately, too many defenseless children are forced to endure abuse at the hands of their carers, making their lives a living hell. This brings me to my third entry. Dan Slott's Arkham Asylum Living Hell tells the story of mob boss Warren White, who avoids jail on an insanity plea but is sent to Arkham Asylum, where he truly begins his journey into madness. When inside the asylum, the torture of White, now nicknamed Mr. Fish, begins. Firstly, he is attacked by Two-Face and Killer Croc before being raped by his male cellmate, Death Rattle. Subsequently, White falls for his psychiatrist, who is actually the psychotic identity thief Jane Doe in disguise. This horrific reveal explains that Jane was actually masquerading as psychiatrist Anne Carver for 2 months after taking her life in order to have her life. Later on, White's cellmate Death Rattle threatens to kill him until an unlikely guardian steps in. The rather odd but innocuous-looking Humphrey Dumpler has an obsession with putting things back together again, and it seems as if he wants to mend White's situation, as he requests a cell transfer for him. However, it is the moments when White gets to know Humphrey Dumpler that I find most chilling. Dumpler reveals his backstory to White, recounting a time when he was plagued with unfortunate events that saw his house knocked down, the death of his parents, and his pet dog run over. As a result, Dumpler explains that he was forced to live with his abusive grandmother, and it was whilst there that he became obsessed with fixing broken objects. However, his attempts at mending what was broken often resulted in catastrophic disasters. For instance, his attempt to repair a train for failing to stop at his station resulted in a massive accident. His attempt to repair an ATM machine caused it to spew out $20 bills, and his goal of fixing the clock tower caused a chain reaction where all the gigantic props on Gotham's rooftops fell to the streets, culminating in the Sprang Act. It could be seen that his most sinister and gruesome attempt at fixing what was broken involved his grandmother. Believing that his abusive grandmother required repair, Dumpler took out a copy of Grey's Anatomy from the library in order to understand his grandmother's malfunctions. Believing that he could repair her, Dumpler used the book as a manual to take her apart and put her back together again. When we cut back to the present of the prison cell, Dumpler makes a chilling confession. He reveals to White that he only asked for him to be transferred as his new cellmate because he felt that White was the worst person that he had ever met and needed to be fixed. Despite the fact that this comment seems like a threat, it is simply not. Dumpler believes that he is doing White a favour, and this is what I find so disturbing. The fact is that there are real people who believe that their malevolent behaviour is perfectly normal, justified, or for the greater good. In recent times, we have seen this exact thing with acts of terror in the name of religion. What could be more terrifying than living in the presence of people who believe that killing the innocent is noble? My next entry, however, does not just look at the evil in others, but the evil reflected back in ourselves. In second place, I have chosen Scott Snyder's 2011 modern classic, Black Mirror. Snyder skillfully intertwines a group of horrific stories that are all linked to form one long narrative. They also share animalistic motifs, including predatory birds, killer whales, and devourment, among some others. These stories are loaded with some of the most disturbing moments that I have ever witnessed in a Batman graphic novel. Some of the most horrific include a gruesome killer whale autopsy which reveals the body of a woman when Commissioner Gordon arrives too late to save his ex-wife Barbara from the Joker's venom, and when psychopath James Gordon Jr. butchers his former childhood tormentor, Ben Wolfe. One of the most disturbing moments in Black Mirror, however, includes a disguised Dick Grayson who infiltrates the auction house of wealthy cult leader named the Dealer. His plan quickly unravels, however, as he is identified by the dealer, hit with hallucinogenic gas, and attacked by the dealer's cult members. When Grayson awakens from his ordeal, he realizes to his horror that they have devoured his legs. Luckily for him, this is revealed to be a nightmare as he continues to suffer from the hallucinogenic effects of the gas. As disturbing as this moment is, it is not the most disturbing for me in this graphic novel. In my opinion, that honour is reserved for a short tale revolving around a young James Gordon Jr., his stepsister Barbara, and her best friend, Bess Keller. When Bess visits the Gordon household, it is revealed that her and Barbara share a pact where they can only use a science kit when together, as Barbara keeps the box and Bess possesses the key. It is here when Bess first meets Barbara's stepbrother James, who she immediately teases about his physical appearance. James, however, is not impressed and immediately begins to sabotage their pact as he initially tries to break the lock before subtly threatening Bess. It isn't until later on that this subtle threat proves to be a very real prophecy as Bess goes missing on her way back home. Despite their best efforts, however, Bess cannot be found, but in a chilling revelation, Barbara explains that she saw Bess's keychain in James Jr.'s hand. Despite the fact that Roy Blount, a serial killer that Commissioner Gordon hunts down, later indirectly confesses to killing Bess, it could be argued that it was James Jr. all along. There are subtle clues to suggest that James Jr. is her actual killer, such as him opening the science kit soon after Bess's disappearance. When Commissioner Gordon asks him how he opened the science case, James Jr. gives a chilling response. "I use this knife, this plain old knife." This ambiguous reply perhaps hints at the murder weapon that James used on Bess. Years later, when Commissioner Gordon tracks down his own son, he enters his home to find a box containing the keys of everyone he's ever killed, which also includes Bess Keller's keychain on top of the pile. This horrific discovery makes us question the death of Bess all over again. Was James Jr. falsely accused, or was Blount wrongfully convicted? These events also make us question our own justice system, where we cannot necessarily be certain of convicting the correct people. However, what I find most chilling about this moment is the fact that it suggests the murder of a child by a younger child. We associate children with innocence, however there seems nothing innocent about James Jr. through his deliberate attempts at sabotage, disturbing threats, and/or uncanny ability to predict the future. His sinister depiction is compounded by Jock and Francesco Francavilla's artistic illustrations. James Jr. always seems to possess a demonic red hue, which juxtaposes his rather geeky physical appearance. In addition to this, there are times when his face is in complete darkness, accentuating his mirror-like glasses and concealing his eyes as windows to any soul. James Jr. is the ultimate paradox we all fear, the innocent, unassuming child who is actually the sinister killer underneath it, the only problem being that we cannot actually prove it. As disturbing and macabre as my 4 previous entries have been, my number 1 stands alone as the unrivaled champion. From the moment I first read it to this very day, it remains as the most disturbing Batman graphic novel that I have ever read. Grant Morrison's 1989 classic Arkham Asylum took its readers to a place far darker than any other comic has done before or since. The story revolves around the Joker, who has forced Batman into a deadly game of hide-and-seek within the asylum in order to prove that he is just as insane as the villains he convicts. The Dark Knight is given 1 hour to escape Arkham before his adversaries are set loose on him. As disturbing as Batman's encounters with his enemies are, I am often left in shock and awe at the parallel narrative involving the asylum's owner, Amadeus Arkham. His story begins during the 1920s with his mother's descent into madness and the supernatural hauntings that he experiences. One particularly disturbing set of frames includes a young Amadeus taking some tea to his mother, who is in her bedchamber. Upon arrival, his mother explains that she has already eaten, as beetles fall from her mouth. It is not until later that Amadeus realizes that she did this because beetles represent rebirth. Years later, Amadeus recounts the time when his wife and daughter were brutally raped and murdered by one of his former patients, a serial killer named Martin Mad Dog Hawkins. This incident depicts one of the most harrowing frames in this entire comic, as Arkham sees the headless body of his decapitated daughter. When he questions the whereabouts of her head, his answer is literally staring him in the face, as he sees his daughter's remains in the dollhouse. As the reader, we share in Arkham's horror as the fourth wall is broken and we look straight into the eyes of his deceased daughter. This tragedy brings back the memory of his mother's death, which he attributed to suicide. In actual fact, Arkham had repressed the real events involving his mother's death. During the years leading up to her demise, Elizabeth Arkham had delusions that she was being tormented by a giant bat which represented the spectre of death. As a result, she would call upon her son to protect her, and in order to liberate her from her suffering, Amadeus cuts her throat with a pearl-handled straight razor. In a moment that is reminiscent of Norman Bates in Psycho, a highly traumatized Amadeus would put on his mother's wedding dress, kneel in the blood of his family, and vow to bind the evil spirit of the bat to the house through ritual and sorcery. Even after being sectioned to the asylum as a patient himself, Amadeus used his fingernails to scratch the words of the binding spell into the walls and floor of his cell until the day he died. When putting this list together, I wanted to find my top 5 most disturbing Batman graphic novels. However, perhaps I always knew which would be my number 1. To this day, no comic or graphic novel has disturbed me to the extent of Arkham Asylum. This book has the total package. It has grotesque gore, graphic violence, body horror, the supernatural, and highly dark subject matter all brought together in a surrealist nightmare through Dave McKean and Grant Morrison's artistic style. If you enjoyed this video, you may want to watch the moments I referred to, as I have put them together in audio-visual format. You can find these in my audio-visual comic playlist on my YouTube channel.